Hello, we are very delighted today to have with us at earth.org Ms. Danna Staaf, who is the author of the book Nursery Earth. This is what's described as the wondrous lives of baby animals and the extraordinary ways that they shape our world. And we do a lot of hardcore climate change energy policy books at earth.org. So it's a great alternative to see a little bit more about the biology of Earth and not just the industrial pollutants that are that are affecting it all day. So welcome, Danna.
Thank you. It's so wonderful to be here.
Yeah, and just to start off, I'd like you to tell us a little bit about yourself, introduce your own background, and what was the moment you said, I've got to write this book.
Absolutely. So I have been pretty obsessed with animals as far back as I can remember. And it started with, I think, the animals that appeal to every little kid, kittens and puppies and squirrels in the backyard. And then I went to an aquarium when I was about 9 or 10. My family took me to the Monterey Bay Aquarium in California. I grew up in Los Angeles, so it was a bit of a road trip. And I saw an octopus there, and I just completely fell in love. I was like, this is an alien on Earth. And this kind of I think marked the beginning of me getting really into weird animals, but in particular, I just like had this thing for octopuses from then on. I ended up with a pet octopus in my home. I learned how to scuba dive so I could go and visit octopuses, and eventually became a marine biologist. So I got to the point where I had gone through an undergraduate degree in marine biology. I was in graduate school studying squid. My interest in octopuses had expanded to the entire group of squid, octopuses, cuttlefish that are called cephalopods. And the particular project that I was doing was looking at the development of squid. And we were looking at how these very large squid, the particular species we were studying, the Humboldt squid, gets about as big as me as an adult. They grew from tiny, tiny little babies. And so I was spending a lot of time with these eggs that were the size of grains of rice and the little hatchlings coming out of them and trying to understand how they swim, how they live, what they're eating. And while I was working on that, I spent a summer in Friday Harbor, which is in Puget Sound off of Washington State in the Pacific Northwest, taking a class on developmental biology. And this was really the catalyst for the seed that became this book, because I wanted to learn how to study baby animals because I was doing this research on squid. But in so doing, I had sort of a callback to that first Meet the Octopus moment, where I was introduced to this incredible diversity of baby animals. And so it's like imagine that you knew about butterflies and you had seen butterflies and you knew what a butterfly was, and then somebody showed you a caterpillar for the first time in your life and you had never seen a caterpillar before, and they were like, this is a baby butterfly. And it would just like blow your mind, right? Because it doesn't have wings, it doesn't have the same colors. And that was the experience of taking this course in developmental biology. We studied dozens of different animals that look one way as an adult, a sea urchin, starfish, lots of fish, actually, sponges, corals, all kinds of things. And then we met their babies. And they look totally different, just absolutely nothing like the adult. They all go through a metamorphosis, just like a caterpillar does to become a butterfly. And that really grabbed me. I did finish my work on the squid and get a PhD in squid, but it really stayed with me, this sense of there's this whole world of babies out there, and they're so different from the adults. And then after graduate school, after I got my PhD and I had worked as a marine biologist, I kind of switched gears to be a science communicator. Which is something that really combines all of my passions. I've always loved writing. I've always loved public speaking and art and comics, and now I get to combine all those things. And I'm kind of this in between the laboratory science, the field science, and the public and people who might be interested in learning about it but can't necessarily go visit a lab or go out in the field. And that's where I work. So I write books, but I also write shorter articles. I do all kinds of different outreach and communication. And And while doing that, and in that sort of switch in my public career, I also went through a internal metamorphosis in my private life and became a mother. I had two children during that time of becoming a science communicator, and so I had babies in my own life. And it
Mm,
really struck me that even though human babies don't go through a metamorphosis, they don't look as different as a caterpillar and a butterfly. They still are very different from adults. And they're not just incomplete adults. They're very good at doing the things that they need to do. They're
mm,
incredibly good at picking up language, way better than
mm.
adult humans, just for one example. And so it brought me back to this idea. And so the next time that it came up that had an opportunity to put together a book proposal, I was talking with my agent about it, this idea about writing about babies and writing about all babies and what they have in common really gelled.
You put a lot of that into the book. Every once in a while, you refer to yourself almost as, as a human. And it's a wonderful way of injecting that, well, almost a non-species centric point of view. So to, put us as one, to put us in our place almost, to see where, where we are all in this area. But that's actually interesting. So you're not only a scientist, but a scientist communicator. You said also comic books. So you're a comic book artist as well?
Yeah, I like to draw mostly short comics. I don't have
Hmm.
any like super long graphic novels, but yeah, for example, I worked with a comics artist called named Sam Julian on this book called How the Octopus Lost Its Shell.
All right.
And he actually this is all his art on the cover, but
Hmm.
then the inside there's a few pages that have my artwork as well. I did a piece here about how to draw an anatomically correct octopus mermaid, which is a lot of fun. And so, yeah, I find that I really enjoy visual media, storytelling
Hmm.
media, exploring different ways of getting concepts across. And that was a fun part of this book, actually, is I was able to put some of my own illustrations in it. And also, there's another comic artist, Rob Lang, who draws this series called Underdone Comics, where he takes
Mm.
quite detailed scientific studies about animals and often about environmental impacts on different animals, but sometimes about their life histories and their development. And I reached out to him when I was working on this book and said, could I put some of your art in the book? And he was excited about it. So I really like those sort of interdisciplinary approaches.
Now, somewhere at the end of the book, you actually mentioned that a lot of people were surprised, or they think that Nursery Earth is a book for children,
Right.
and you know that's that's obviously not the case. I mean, I'm not sure how many small children, at least, would appreciate the the level of detail about the Humboldt squid, and to be frank, the amount of death that happens
Yes,
among
a lot of depth.
uh, the juveniles. Um, but so who is this book for? And I mean, who is the intended audience?
It's a great question. Yeah, it's a popular science book for the general public, and so I wrote it with the hopes that it would be accessible to any readers in the sort of adult, high school, maybe middle schoolers who get really into the. Like, I was the kind of middle schooler who was reading this sort of book, but it's not written for young readers. It's written for
Mhm.
adults, and that's reflected in the language and I didn't really flinch away from a lot of the death and um the sadder or more intense aspects of life. But it's it was my hope was to write it in a way that would be accessible even for a reader who doesn't have any kind of science background, who might be picking it up just because they're interested in babies. In
Mhm.
particular, I had in mind, when humans have human babies come into their lives, whether it's because we become parents ourselves, or we see a family member becoming a parent, or maybe just because we move into a neighborhood where there are kids, I think we naturally have a lot of curiosity about how that development happens. And it often brings back memories from our own childhood that maybe we don't remember until we're interacting with kids
Mm.
ourselves. Like, oh, I remember I had a hard time learning to read, maybe, for example, somebody might remember that. Or I remember that I had these really irrational fears. Why was that? And
Mm.
I felt like this book would be a great way to show people that those things that we remember from our own childhood, or that we see our children going through, are really universal, a lot of
Mm.
them. The children of lots of species have adapted all of their own ways to learn things, to adapt, to like integrate information about their environment. So if they're growing up in a dangerous environment, they'll integrate
Mhm.
that and actually build an adult body that's better able to deal with that stress or cope with that stress. And I think it's very cool. I think it's very honestly, it feels sort of like meeting all your extended family to me.
Yeah, you know, as something I could see, you just mentioned, I could very much imagine a talented or say gifted high school student reading this and wanting to become a developmental biologist and say, yeah, that's for me. I mean, that's absolutely something I could see. But I think it's almost maybe important for the older readers as well, because for myself, and I think you mentioned this as well, there's so much in here that was not yet discovered when I was in high school. And things
Yeah.
that I thought, wait a minute, that's not how that works. And actually, maybe you can share a couple of examples of the kind of things that maybe haven't reached the standard high school or even college curriculum yet.
Absolutely. Because I think that also, you said who's the book for? Well, fundamentally, it's also for me. Whenever I write something, I am my own first audience,
Mm,
and I'm always writing it because I want to know more about
yeah.
it. And so, really, like researching this book was an excuse for me to get to call up a bunch of scientists and ask them, like, okay, what's going on here? And what's this and what's
Mm,
that? Yeah, absolutely. I think that the thing that has really changed a lot in like in terms of where scientific papers are being published, but hasn't yet gotten into a lot of textbooks, is how malleable the developmental process is.
mm,
I think people were understandably really excited to learn about genes.
yeah.
And so we ended up with this curriculum where we learn Darwinian evolution and we learn Mendelian genetics, and you learn about pea plants and you learn how crosses work and you learn why people get blue eyes or brown eyes
Mhm,
depending on what their parents have. And that stuff is not wrong. It's just that for a while I think science kind of went overboard, and this is just how humans are. Like we're a pendulum that swings back and forth, right? We kind of went overboard thinking genes are the answer to everything.
mhm,
And once you can sequence the genome of an organism, it's fully predictable. There was even this line where a scientist said that they thought the egg would be computable, basically meaning you take
mm,
any fertilized egg for any animal, because we all start out as a fertilized egg. So you've got the full genome that's going to make that animal. And then it's basically just like running a computer program.
mhm,
And that's what the organism is doing it. You could run it on a computer and you can see exactly what that organism is going to be. And what we've learned is how much of that program is really a conversation between the developing organism
mm,
and the environment. And so genes get turned off or on depending on cues in the environment, chemicals that the embryo encounters, temperature that the embryo or the larva encounters, and especially the microbes that they encounter. And this isn't even just in development. This is in biology more broadly, that there's been a total revolution of understanding how each of us is a combination of organisms. We have
mhm,
our gut bacteria, our gut microbiome, and we have our microbiome on our skin, all of the bacteria, which when I was a kid, there was at least the phrase good bugs. I remember learning about
mm,
good bugs and bad bugs, and the bad bugs would make you sick, and the good bugs helped you digest your food. So there was a little bit of a sense of that. But I think we understand more and more now how much the relationships that we have with the microbes living in and on us shape who we are and how our
mm,
development changes. And there's a lot of organisms, this has been studied a lot in insects in particular, that can't even develop without the right microbiome and position having this conversation with their genes. And it's just amazing.
no, that's quite incredible. Now, you actually structured the book almost, I don't want to say, was it a ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, or is it the other way around?
It is
Um,
kind of a recapitulation.
um, but you structure the book, parallel to the development of the developing organism. Starting with the embryo and going to egg brooding, and eventually the juveniles, and then leaving the nest. And I wonder, um, was that obvious to you? Said, yeah, this is definitely how I'm going to do it, or had you considered other structures like, okay, well, maybe I'll do squids first, and or cephalopods first and something else later.
Yeah, I think for a while when I was gathering my research together, it did kind of make sense for me to be glomping things together
Mm,
by taxonomic regions. So like here's all
mhm,
the insect stuff. Have I talked to all of the insect people? Have I gotten all of the stuff about insect development? And maybe here's all the mammals and here's all the birds and stuff. But it pretty quickly became clear to me that if I tried to write the book like that with an insect chapter and a mammal
mm,
chapter and a bird chapter, I would lose the main point that I wanted to get across, which is the commonality of
mm,
development between all of these different or groups. That what I was saying, that we all start life as a fertilized egg.
yeah.
But if I talk about a chicken egg in one chapter, and then you have to wait a whole chapter before you learn about a caterpillar egg, and a whole other chapter before we learn about the egg that grows into an embryo inside a placental mammal, then we kind of lose that connection. And so that, even though it was sometimes a bit challenging, that was a lot of fun to play, and especially when I got to metamorphosis, because
Mm,
the really catastrophic changes, it's actually called catastrophic metamorphosis, that something like a butterfly goes through is not universal. Humans do not spin a cocoon, completely rebuild our body inside. And yet, when you drill down to the sorts of changes that are happening in adolescence as a body reaches sexual maturity and starts to produce the necessary gametes for producing the next generation, there's actually a lot of commonality with metamorphosis, even if we're not doing this catastrophic thing. So I had a lot of fun being like, okay, here's the chapter on metamorphosis, and I want to put some mammals in it. So how
mm.
am I going to do that?
I don't know if you've seen the meme going around that says, when a caterpillar becomes a pupa, it doesn't just go back into a cocoon, it mutates into a sludge of disgusting goo before emerging, and that's what happens to us. But now I'm wondering whether you wrote that meme.
No, I'm not responsible for it, but I'm glad that information is getting out there. I think it's important. Yeah.
I mean, that's something that I was going to ask anyway, but some of the things that would be very surprising to a reader that they didn't know about. I mean, we touched on this a little bit, what had not been included in your standard high school curriculum. But what do you think would, and what have you found so far when people have been reading the book that say like, wow, I never knew that.
The metamorphosis is a great place to
Mm,
start, because just kind of realizing how much an organism can change and yet genetically remain the same. It's that, like, is it just running a program? There's clearly more than
mm,
that. So caterpillars turn into goo and essentially rebuild their body. There's a group of worms called ribbon worms that don't look at all like worms as larvae. When they hatch out of the egg, they're these cute little shapes. Some of them are sort of triangular shapes, and some of them are sort of like round, almost look like little helmet shapes. And all of them, the way they develop and eventually metamorphose is they grow the worm inside them. They actually
mm,
kind of grow the adult body that they're going to become inside their little larval body. And then that little worm turns itself inside out and eats the larval body. And I love that, like the consumption of self as
mm,
you're moving on to the next stage of life is just like absolutely amazing. And then there's sort of speaking about other like slightly disturbing things that happen, then you have all of the parasitic wasps that are laid as eggs inside other babies. So it's like the nesting doll of babies, and you have baby wasps, which are like tiny, tiny little caterpillars, tiny little grubby things inside a larger caterpillar, and they're growing and developing and eating the caterpillar from the inside out. And at first you're like, oh, that's horrible, the poor caterpillar. But then you learn, well, the caterpillars that they do it to are often really significant crop pests that are causing a lot of
mm.
damage and decreasing the amount of food that humans are able to grow. And so when people introduce these wasps, that whose babies will kill the caterpillars, then they're actually protecting and increasing the amount of food available for humans. And so it's just like
Oh, incredible.
absolutely wild stuff.
Now, in a certain way, I've realized I'm glad you didn't organize the chapters around taxonomic groups, because in that case, maybe everyone would just skip to the mammal chapter because they're looking for the cute baby, maybe the cute baby birds and the fluffy little things. But there are a lot of slimy and weird and wonderful things that are not at all cute and fluffy. And I was wondering how people have reacted to that so far. Were they expecting something different, or did they get the idea from this wonderful cover illustration that includes, If you haven't seen it, it's on the back. It's grubs, it's worms, it's squid, it's and yes, there's a baby bunny on there. So how have
Yes.
people reacted to this?
Yeah, I knew it was a bit of a bait and switch to say, here's a book about baby animals, and then you open it up and there's maggots and there's tadpoles and you're like, where are the kittens? But there's a few kittens in there. And I think that it's at least the people who have talked to me about it, it's always been very good natured. Um I think that I like to think I managed to inject enough humor and levity and my own love for these animals. Like I genuinely think they are the best. And I think that enough of that gets through that when I've heard from readers, and maybe they're saying, ew, I don't like this, but it's with a sort of humor to it, and they're fascinated by it. And I think I was lucky enough, perhaps, to be able to tap into this sort of, it's the same thing that I think makes people kind of really interested in horror. Where you're like, I need to know what's going to happen next, even if it's horrifying. So, or at least people have been nice enough, if they really hated it, nobody's come and told me. So.
I mean, we are in October, where I understand the Halloween machine is in full. The Halloween industrial complex is in full
Right.
force in the U.S. right now. Um, and that's something, maybe this is a Halloween book you never knew you needed.
That's a good point. I should think about that.
Uh, Now, one thing that I mentioned right in the beginning is that a lot of the coverage of Earth.org is, it's climate policy, and sometimes that can be quite depressing. And I thought, okay, well, this will be a nice break, to learn about squids and worms. But it was surprising the degree to which climate change kept showing up.
Mm.
And maybe you can talk us through a little bit of that, and also, where are the biggest risks that you see? Like, where are the biggest impacts that are happening?
Yeah, honestly, it was a surprise to me as well as I was doing the research, and I think definitely it's one of the things that comes along with this new understanding that we were talking about of how much the environment impacts the organism. And no baby is developing in a vacuum. And in particular, there are a lot of species of animals that depend on signals from their environment to make sort of decisions in their development. And in particular, we tend to think of the development of an organism as becoming male or female as a genetic thing because we have sex chromosomes, X and Y sex chromosomes. But a lot of animals actually make that developmental distinction environmentally. And so a number of lizards, for example, turtles, crocodiles, as the egg is developing, a different temperature will cause it to develop into an adult that produces sperm or an adult that produces eggs. And so you can imagine if they're kind of straddling that line and they've evolved to have a range of temperatures that produces some males and some females, and then the overall temperature is increasing, that's going to cause a problem. And it's interesting, it's not consistent. In some species, that's producing a bias towards males. And in some
Mm,
species, it's producing a bias towards females because they've evolved along these different trajectories. But in either case, it's a problem because especially if it goes all the way, then you end
mm,
up with an adult population that can't produce both eggs and sperm. And then you're in a serious bind for producing the next generation. And at the same time, some of these species do seem to be, I mean, obviously they have evolved over time to a changing environment. And even though the environment now is changing much, much, much faster than it was before, there's some signs that their evolutionary mechanism is also changing along with it.
mm,
So, and they're also shifting their habitats as well, which can be beneficial for their short-term survival, but sometimes like how much habitat is there for them to move into?
mm,
So the one thing that I was really surprised, I think, to read about that in addition to the basic temperature change that we all know about that's happening with climate change, there's also a lot of impacts to animal development, especially in the ocean, from changing acidity.
mm.
And so as carbon dioxide dissolves into the ocean, it changes the pH of the ocean, it becomes more acidic. And so you're like, okay, obviously you don't want a baby snail growing up in acid because it can't build a shell. But pH affects a lot of other things as well, and the way that they develop their digestive systems and their nervous systems and all this stuff.
And I think at every stage of development as well.
Yeah, so then it will also affect metamorphosis. It'll affect how long an animal spends in that in between stage, which can sometimes be very vulnerable to predators. And so, and then it relates to all this other stuff, maybe a change in acidity makes something more vulnerable to parasites or something
Hmm.
like that.
Um, Now, I know that when you are talking to specialists in particular fields who are really doing deep dives into a particular area, they have these wonderful specialized controversies that people argue about and have fist fights in the parking lot. So, tell me, what are these specialized controversies of developmental biology, and where, and what sort of cage fight can we look forward to from this area?
That's such a great question. It's true. People get really into the
Oh yeah.
the obscurity, as
Mm,
I'm sure you know, in different, and it's great because I that's where we learn new things. Even if
yeah.
we perhaps who are external to it don't understand why it's so important, then that devotion to really figuring out what's going on there gets us a new understanding often, which is very cool. Um, See, I need to think for a moment because what I initially was going to say um, was that there's this age-old nature versus nurture debate. Does an organism
Mm,
develop based on its nature, its DNA, whatever's intrinsic to it, or by the way it's raised, by what's outside of it? But really, I think that that understanding that it's both, it isn't one or the
mm,
other, is really has really sort of propagated throughout most of the field, which is neat to see that it isn't either or, it's this and that. That there's an incredible amount of information that's intrinsic to the animal, and that little changes in that information can then lead to incredible diversity
mm,
of sort of evolutionary lines of different things that have come about on Earth. And then also that it's always in conversation with the environment, with the nurture that's happening around it. So I'm trying to think if there's another example of one of these really obscure.
Well, I mean, just for one, are the impacts of climate change, is that something that's under discussion, or is that more or less accepted by everybody?
I think everybody knows that there are impacts, but then you get into these
Mm,
interesting questions of what the impact is. And I'm remembering that there are these lizards that are found in some habitats to be all female, and in other habitats to be a mix of male and female. And so there's this question of, are they able to reproduce when when they're in
mm.
these different sex ratios or not. Um, but I'm sorry, I feel like I should have
Oh,
reread that bit because I don't
no,
remember the.
not at all. In fact, that was probably something that I certainly, when talking about the male and female ratios in different habitats, and I might have skimmed over this part, but the idea that the baby animals can, or the baby creatures can impact the sex ratios of the parents. Was that something? I believe it was in clownfish. Um,
Oh,
and the Finding Nemo, what would have happened in real life?
right. So it isn't so much that there's a direct um uh, influence on the parents of the babies, but
Mm,
just that the overall uh, population, if there aren't enough, let's see, if there aren't enough females in the population, some of the males will actually turn female. So it's
mm,
sort of this later in life metamorphosis that a number of fish are capable of, just sort of based on what the ratio around them is.
mm,
They'll switch over so that you have enough males to fertilize the females, or enough females to lay eggs. And so, in the situation in this traumatic opening of Finding Nemo, where Nemo's mother gets eaten along with all of his siblings, the father, who's left behind, Marlin, would probably have switched sexes to become female, since there was now no longer a female who could lay eggs, and laying eggs is an incredibly important part of producing the next generation.
and I'm not sure if Hollywood will make that movie.
We can wait, you
We can only wait. I mean, you've certainly drawn a lot of parallels to your own, production of babies. I think I particularly liked the line that, after I think you got your degree and then got married and settled down to the production of babies. In this case, a million of them, and not your own. Um,
Yes.
so there were a lot of times, I think, throughout the course of writing this book where you drew parallels to, okay, I'm an organism, I've produced my own babies. Is there anything that stands out from there that you thought, okay, this is really, now I see myself in this grander scheme,
I
as
think
a parent.
yeah, yeah. The millions of babies that I was trying. I don't know that I ever actually made quite that many of them, but that was the squid, of course, that I was
Mm,
working on because these Humboldt squid, the ones that start out like little grains of rice and then get to
mm,
be as big as I am, it was quite difficult. In fact, before I started my PhD, nobody had ever found their eggs in the wild. And so to study the babies, I was actually collecting unfertilized eggs from females, collecting sperm from males, mixing them in petri dishes to produce the baby squid that I needed to study. And that was before I had children of my own. And so I
mm,
had this experience of making babies, in a petri dish, in a sort of somewhat sterile lab environment. And it was still magical. I
mm,
think that was really something when I was doing it with the squid, and then later when I took this summer course that I mentioned, that was actually something that we did over and over again, in vitro fertilization. Because if you start the embryo yourself by taking the sperm and the egg and mixing it, then you can actually see every single step of development from a single cell. An egg is
mm,
one cell, which just still actually boggles my mind to think about. Even a huge ostrich egg is one cell,
mm,
and then it gets fertilized, and then it starts to divide. And watching that process happen, and it can happen very, very quickly, from one cell to two cells to three to four, and then quickly so many that you can't even count them, is magical, really. And I
mm,
don't mean that it isn't also scientific, but I think that scientists who have found some of the most amazing things about development, like how those cells then know to divide into what's going to be the outside of the organism and what's going to be the inside, how they make the first gut. They've had a lot of wonder for it. Ernest Everett Just, who was one of the early developmental biologists who studied sea urchin embryos and other embryos and like really like gave us the picture of the
mm,
developing egg that people then built on, talked about the vast wonder of the cell. And I
yeah.
think that sense of you can really see an animal building itself in real time when you watch development, going from something that doesn't look like anything, looks it's a cell, it's a blob, it doesn't look like an animal, over the course of hours to days, depending, or to weeks, into something that suddenly you're like, okay, this has a gut, this has a place for food to come in and for food to come out, and now it has limbs, it has
Mm,
all of the parts that it's going to need to move around, and they start moving often inside the egg. A lot of the marine embryos kind of blur the line between embryo and larva because they'll start moving and feeding, and then they look pretty much the same once they're spinning through the
mm,
water, collecting little bits of food and stuff. And it's just absolutely incredible that it's happening over and over again all the time, in the ocean, in the garden, in the city, in the farm, in everywhere. And I think that it really um, then connected for me with, when it was happening in my own body. I'm part of this incredible process of life moving itself forward, creating itself, even when we don't know how to run the program. Those organisms and those cells that have been talking to each other, and they're like sort of continuing these evolutionary conversations that go back millions of years. It's beautiful, really.
what a sense of awe.
Yeah.
Now, you mentioned that you are also doing a lot of other works, whether it's comic books or kids' books. What are some of the other ones that you're working on now, or what can we expect coming up in the future?
I'm working on a book that I'm not allowed to announce yet. But that's it's gonna be great. It's very
All
exciting.
right.
And I'm always working on a lot of shorter pieces as well. And so I've been working on some pieces I've written for Smithsonian Magazine and for Atlas Obscura about like I try to write as much as I can about the weird animals that nobody knows
Yes,
about. But sometimes those are surprisingly right under our noses. Like I am looking now at this whale called Rice's whale that lives in the Gulf of Mexico. It's a whole species of whale that lives only in the Gulf of Mexico and nowhere else. And I didn't know it existed until I started
pretty
looking into
cool.
it. There's a lot of diversity out there.
That's fantastic. Now, before we close, I wanted to ask you one last thing, which is what books are on your own shelf that you've been reading lately, and especially one that you would recommend to Earth.org readers.
I pulled a book off the shelf to show you. So thank you for asking. This book is called Wild Souls. It's won a lot of prizes. You can see it's got the Los Angeles Times Book Prize finalist. So people may have heard of it already.
Hmm.
This book for me really beautifully encapsulates this sense of humanity as part of nature. Emma
Mm,
Maris is never willing to accept this sort of shorthand of humans versus nature or technology being something that's separate from the rest of the world.
right.
She really makes you see it. She really brings you along with her to see us as a species that not only is now but always has been completely intertwined with the world around us. And it's just beautiful, beautiful writing asking this important but hard question. What do we owe animals in a changing
Mm,
world? What does it mean? Like, and she really balances pride and humility. Like, how much responsibility do we have? And versus how much do should we expect that we know best versus let other animals do the things that they do best. And there aren't always easy answers, but she writes with such clarity that it makes it easier to think about even the hard questions, if that makes sense. And it's really a beautiful book. So highly
well,
recommend it. Wild Souls.
fantastic. Well, that's probably, I hope, something that will be on our readers list directly after they read Nursery Earth by Danna Staaf. So thank you very much. You've been very generous with your time, and we'll look forward to hearing more from you in the near future when the secret project comes out at last.
Thank you so much.
All right, thanks a lot.